The village of Valeni clung to the edge of the Transylvanian mountains, like a desperate prayer whispered into the void. Its wooden houses huddled together beneath thatched roofs, blackened by centuries of smoke and sorrow, their windows shuttered against the darkness that descended each evening, with the inevitability of divine judgment. Beyond the village, the Carpathian peaks rose like the broken teeth of some ancient beast, and atop the highest cliff, barely visible through the perpetual mist, stood Castle Dracula, a monument to damnation itself. Elena Vasile had lived all 23 years of her life in the shadow of that castle, yet she had never once looked directly at it. Her grandmother had taught her that to gaze upon the Count's domain was to invite his attention, and in Valeni, attention from the castle meant only one thing: death. "Keep your eyes on the earth, child," her grandmother had whispered on her deathbed 3 winters past. "The ground is where we all return. It's the only certainty we have in this cursed place." Eleanor had obeyed. She kept her gaze lowered as she walked through the village each morning, her long dark hair bound tightly beneath a simple linen kerchief, her dress modest and grey as the stones of the church. She spoke little, prayed much, and tended to the sick with hands that trembled with compassion rather than fear. The villagers called her their angel, though Elena knew she was nothing so grand. She was simply a woman trying to live a quiet life in a place where quiet lives were the only ones that endured. But that was before the sickness came. It began in late autumn, when the first frost painted the fields silver and the harvests had been gathered into barns that would feed the village through the brutal winter. Old Petru, the blacksmith, was the first to fall ill. He complained of weakness, of a coldness in his bones that no fire could warm. Within 3 days he was dead, his skin pale as milk, his eyes sunken deep into his skull as though something had hollowed him out from within. Then came Maria, the baker's wife, then young Andrei, barely 15, then the widow Popescu and her 2 daughters. The priest, Father Andrei, a gaunt man whose faith had been weathered by decades of ministering to the doomed, gathered the villagers in the church. Candlelight flickered across faces drawn tight with terror as he stood before the wooden cross, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "We are being punished," he said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "The Count demands tribute, and we have grown complacent. We have forgotten our place." Eleanor sat in the back pew, her hands folded in her lap, her heart heavy with dread. She knew what tribute meant. Every village in the shadow of Castle Dracula knew. Once every generation, when the Count's hunger grew too great, a tribute was required, a life offered willingly to spare the rest. "We must choose," Father Andrei continued, and his voice cracked like splitting wood. "One soul, given freely, so that the many may live." The church erupted into chaos. Voices rose in anger and desperation, accusations flying like stones. Who would go? Who could be spared? Mothers clutched their children, husbands shielded their wives, and the elderly sat in silence, knowing their names would be spoken first. Elena closed her eyes and felt the weight of every prayer she had ever whispered settle upon her shoulders. She thought of her grandmother's grave in the churchyard, of the small cottage where she lived alone now, of the patients who depended on her healing touch. She thought of all the reasons she had to live. And then she thought of all the reasons she had to die. "I will go." The words left her mouth before she fully understood she had spoken them. The church fell silent. Every head turned toward her, and Elena rose from the pew on legs that felt like water. She walked down the aisle, past the faces of people she had known her entire life, past the mothers who had thanked her for saving their children, past the men who had called her blessed. Father Andrei stared at her with eyes full of grief and relief in equal measure. "Elena," he whispered, "you cannot mean this." "I do." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. "I am unmarried. I have no children. My work can be learned by another." She paused and something cold settled in her chest. "And I have never known fear the way it should be known. Perhaps this is why I was born, to spare those who have more reason to live." The priest reached out as though to touch her shoulder, then withdrew his hand as if she had already become something untouchable. "You are pure," he said quietly, "untouched. The Count will find you acceptable." The word hung in the air like a noose. Acceptable, as though she were a lamb being inspected before slaughter. "When?" Eleanor asked. 3 nights hence, on the night of the new moon, when darkness is absolute." Father Andrei's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "How you will be taken to the gates of the castle. What happens after—" He could not finish. Elena nodded. She turned to face the congregation, and saw in their eyes the terrible mixture of gratitude and shame that would haunt them for the rest of their days. She saw mothers pulling their children closer, husbands embracing their wives, the elderly weeping with relief that it would not be them. And in that moment, Eleanor understood the true nature of sacrifice. It was not noble. It was not beautiful. It was simply necessary. The next 3 days passed like a fever dream. Eleanor went about her duties with mechanical precision, tending to the sick, though she knew she would not live to see them recover. She prepared her herbs and remedies, writing down instructions for whoever would take her place. She cleaned her cottage until every surface gleamed, as though making herself ready for a journey. The villagers avoided her eyes now. They brought her gifts, bread, honey, a warm shawl, and left them on her doorstep without knocking. She had become a ghost before her time, already mourned, already lost. On the second night, she sat alone in her cottage and lit a single candle. In its flickering light, she stared at her reflection in the small mirror above her washbasin. Dark eyes looked back at her, set in a face that was unremarkable except for its pallor and the stubborn set of her jaw. She touched her lips with trembling fingers. "I have never been kissed," she whispered to her reflection. The words felt strange on her tongue, a confession to no one and nothing. She had never allowed herself to think of such things, of romance, of desire, of the warmth of another's touch. In Valeni, such thoughts were luxuries reserved for those who did not live in the shadow of damnation. Now she would die without ever knowing what it meant to be wanted, to be loved, to feel another's lips upon her own. The thought should have made her weep, but Elena had no tears left. She blew out the candle and went to bed, sleeping the dreamless sleep of the condemned. The third day dawned grey and cold. Elena, dressed in her simplest white gown, the one she had sewn for her first communion years ago. It was too tight now across her shoulders and chest, but it was the closest thing she had to a burial shroud. She braided her hair with hands that no longer shook. She had moved beyond fear into a strange, cold calm. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Father André came to her door. Behind him stood 3 village men, their faces grim, their eyes unable to meet hers. "It is time," the priest said. Elena nodded. She picked up the small wooden cross her grandmother had given her and clasped it in her hands. Then she stepped out of her cottage for the last time. The entire village had gathered to watch her departure. They lined the dirt road in silence, a corridor of witnesses to her sacrifice. Eleanor walked between them with her head held high, though inside she felt as hollow as the victims of the plague. She saw old Marta weeping, saw young children clinging to their mothers' skirts, saw the men removing their caps in respect. At the edge of the village, a wooden cart waited, its bed lined with dried flowers, white roses and wolfsbane, symbols of purity and protection that would offer no protection at all. Eleanor climbed into the cart without assistance and sat upon the flowers, her white dress stark against their withered petals. The driver, a man named Vasile who had known her father, took up the reins with hands that shook. He said nothing as he urged the horses forward, and Elena did not look back at the village that had been her entire world. The road to Castle Dracula wound up through the mountains like a serpent. The cart creaked and groaned over the rough stones, and the horses snorted nervously, their ears flat against their skulls. The forest pressed close on either side, ancient trees whose branches twisted into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, almost watching. As they climbed higher, the air grew colder, and the light faded into a twilight that had nothing to do with the position of the sun. Mist curled around the cart's wheels, thick and white as burial shrouds, and Elena could hear things moving in the darkness between the trees, the pad of paws, the rustle of wings, the whisper of voices that were not quite human. Finally, as full darkness claimed the mountain, the trees fell away and the castle loomed before them. Elena had never seen it so close, and the sight stole the breath from her lungs. It was massive beyond comprehension, a sprawling fortress of black stone that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the sky. Towers jutted upward like accusing fingers, their windows dark and empty as the eyes of a corpse. The walls were thick and ancient, stained with centuries of rain and blood, and atop the highest tower, a tattered banner stirred in a wind that Elena could not feel. The cart stopped before the main gate, an iron monstrosity covered in symbols that made Elena's eyes water to look upon. Vasile remained frozen on the driver's seat, his face white as bone. "Go," Elena said softly. "There is no need for you to wait." "The priest said I should see it done," Vasile whispered, his voice breaking. "You have seen enough. Go home to your wife, kiss your children. Elena climbed down from the cart, her bare feet touching the cold stone of the courtyard. Tell them I was not afraid. It was a lie, but a kind one. Vasile looked at her for a long moment, tears streaming down his weathered face. Then he turned the cart with shaking hands and fled back down the mountain road as though devils pursued him. Elena stood alone before the gates of Castle Dracula. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind moaned through the battlements above, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay and something else, something ancient and hungry. Elena clutched her grandmother's cross tighter and forced herself to breathe. Then, with a groan that sounded like the earth itself splitting open, the gates began to swing inward. Beyond them lay only darkness, a darkness so complete that it seemed solid, as though Eleanor could reach out and touch it. She hesitated for one heartbeat, two, and in that hesitation she thought of running, of fleeing back down the mountain, of hiding in the forest, of choosing cowardice over sacrifice. But then she thought of the children in the village, of old Marta's tears, of all the lives that would be saved by her death. Eleanor stepped through the gates. The darkness swallowed her whole, and behind her, the gates swung shut with a finality that echoed through the night like the closing of a tomb. She walked forward blindly, one hand outstretched, her feet finding purchase on smooth stone floors. The air inside the castle was cold enough to make her breath mist before her face, and it carried a smell that made her stomach turn. Old blood, ancient dust, and underneath it all something that reminded her of her grandmother's deathbed, that sweet, sick scent of decay barely held at bay. Gradually, impossibly, her eyes adjusted. Faint light filtered in from somewhere, perhaps the moon rising beyond the mountains, perhaps something else entirely. She found herself in an enormous hall, its ceiling lost in shadow above. Tapestries hung on the walls, their once bright colors faded to shades of rust and ash, depicting scenes of battles and feasts and horrors that Elena could not bring herself to examine closely. At the far end of the hall, a massive stone staircase curved upward into deeper darkness, and at the foot of that staircase stood a figure. Elena's heart stopped. He was tall and impossibly still, dressed in black that made him seem a part of the shadows themselves. His face was pale as marble, beautiful in the way that ancient statues are beautiful, cold, perfect, inhuman. Dark hair framed features that might have been carved by a master sculptor, and his eyes. His eyes were the color of blood in moonlight, and they fixed upon Eleanor with an intensity that made her knees weaken. Count Dracula did not move, did not speak. He simply looked at her, and in that gaze Elena felt every secret of her soul laid bare. She felt him seeing not just her face but everything beneath it, her fears, her regrets, her desperate hope that death would come quickly and without pain. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Eleanor forced herself to speak, her voice barely a whisper in the vast emptiness of the hall. "I am the tribute," she said. "I have come willingly. I ask only that you honor your bargain and spare my village." The Count's expression did not change, but something flickered in those terrible eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. When he spoke, his voice was like velvet draped over broken glass, cultured and ancient and utterly without warmth. Willingly. He pronounced the word as though tasting it, as though it were strange to him. "They sent you willingly." "I came willingly," Elena corrected, and was surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "They did not send me. I chose this." Something shifted in the Count's face, a tightening around the mouth, a narrowing of those blood-red eyes. "How noble," he said, and there was something in his tone that might have been mockery or might have been something far more painful. "How human." He began to descend the stairs, each step deliberate and measured. Eleanor wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything but stand frozen as death itself approached. But her legs would not obey her, and her voice had abandoned her entirely. The Count stopped 3 paces away from her. This close, Eleanor could see that his skin was not merely pale but translucent, as though he were made of wax and candlelight. She could see the sharp angles of his face, the cruel beauty of his mouth, the way his hands, long-fingered and elegant, hung at his sides with unnatural stillness. And she could see, in the depths of those inhuman eyes, something that looked almost like pain. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elena." The word escaped her lips before she could think better of it. "Elena Vasile." "Elena." He repeated her name slowly, as though committing it to memory. "Do you know why you are here, Elena Vasile?" "To die," she whispered, "so that others may live." The Count tilted his head, studying her with the detached interest of a scholar examining a particularly curious specimen. To die, he echoed. Yes. And do you fear death? Elena opened her mouth to lie, to claim bravery she did not possess, but found she could not. Something about his gaze demanded truth. Yes, she said simply. I fear it very much. For the first time, something like emotion crossed the Count's face, a flicker of what might have been respect or approval, or perhaps just surprise that she had answered honestly. At least you do not bore me with false courage. He moved closer, circling her slowly, and Elena forced herself to remain still even as every instinct screamed at her to flee. Tell me, Elena Vasile, in your 23 years of life, what have you done? What mark have you left upon this world that makes your continued existence worth the price of others' safety? The question cut deeper than any blade. Elena swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. I have healed the sick, she said quietly. I have comforted the dying. I have tried to ease suffering where I could. Ah, a healer. The Count completed his circle and stood before her once more. How quaint. And tell me, little healer, did you ever wonder why there was so much suffering to ease? Did you ever question the God who would allow such pain in his creation? Elena's hand tightened on her grandmother's cross. Faith is not about questions. No, the Count agreed, and his voice was suddenly bitter as poison. Faith is about obedience, about accepting one's place in the grand design, no matter how cruel that design may be. He leaned closer, and Elena could feel the cold radiating from his body like a winter grave. I knew faith once, Elena Vasile. I knew devotion and duty and the terrible weight of righteousness. Do you know what it earned me? He pulled back his lips in a smile that showed teeth too white, too sharp. Damnation! Eleanor's breath came in short gasps now. She could feel tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, though whether from fear or sorrow she could not say. I'm sorry, she whispered, though she did not know why she said it. The Count went utterly still. He stared at her as though she had spoken in a language he did not understand. You are... sorry. His voice was soft, dangerous. For what, precisely? For whatever drove you to this, Elena said, and meant it. No one chooses damnation willingly. Something must have broken inside you, something that once knew love and light, and for that, I am sorry. The silence that followed was absolute. The Count stood frozen before her, his expression unreadable, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made Elena feel as though her very soul was being weighed. Then, without warning, he moved. His hand shot out and grasped her wrist, not roughly but with a grip of iron, and he pulled her closer. Elena gasped at the touch, at the coldness of his skin against hers, at the strength in those long fingers that could crush her bones to powder without effort. Do you know what you are? He whispered, his face now inches from her own. You are a lamb offering itself to the wolf and apologizing for his hunger. You are innocence so profound it borders on insanity. His free hand rose to touch her face, cold fingers tracing the line of her jaw. You are everything I destroyed in myself centuries ago. Elena trembled but did not pull away. She looked into those blood-red eyes and saw, beneath the hunger and the cruelty and the ancient rage, something that made her heart break. Loneliness, absolute and eternal, and utterly without hope. Then take what you need, she said softly. End this. Let me serve the purpose I was meant for. The Count's eyes widened fractionally. His hand, still touching her face, trembled, the first truly human gesture she had seen from him. You would surrender so easily. His voice was hoarse. You would let me drain every drop of blood from your veins, would let me take everything you are and leave nothing but a husk? If it means my village lives, Elena said, yes. And if I told you that your sacrifice means nothing? The Count's fingers tightened on her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. That I will take you and still visit death upon your precious village, that your noble gesture is wasted, that you will die for nothing. Elena felt something crack inside her chest. Not fear, but grief. Grief for all the lives she would not save, for the children who would still die, for the mothers who would weep over empty graves. Then I will die knowing I tried, she whispered. The Count stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, something changed in his face. The cruel mask slipped, and for one heartbeat, Elena saw the man he must have been before damnation claimed him. Proud, yes, and stern, but with a capacity for feeling that centuries of darkness had not quite managed to extinguish. You are either the bravest woman I have ever encountered, he said quietly, or the most foolish. Perhaps both, Elena managed. And then, to her complete shock, the Count did something she had not anticipated. He released her and stepped back. "I will not kill you tonight," he said, and his voice held a note of something that might have been wonder. "Not because you begged for mercy, you did not, but because you have reminded me of something I thought I had forgotten." "What?" Elena breathed. The Count turned away from her, his silhouette stark against the darkness of the great hall. "That there are still creatures in this world capable of selfless sacrifice. That humanity, for all its weakness and foolishness, still harbors sparks of something divine." He paused. "You will remain here as my guest, Elena Vasile. Your village will be spared. But understand this. You are mine now. Your life belongs to me, to do with as I will. You cannot leave. You cannot escape. This castle is your prison, and I am your keeper." Elena's legs finally gave out, and she sank to the stone floor, her white dress pooling around her like spilled milk. Relief and terror warred within her chest, and she could not tell which was stronger. "Why?" she managed to ask. "Why spare me?" The Count looked back over his shoulder, and in the darkness, his eyes seemed to glow. "Because," he said softly, "it has been so very long since anyone looked at me with pity rather than hatred, and I find I wish to understand what manner of woman would mourn for a monster." Then he was gone, vanished into the shadows as though he had never been, leaving Eleanor alone in the vast darkness of the hall with only her racing heart and her grandmother's cross for company. And in that moment, as tears finally spilled down her cheeks, Elena understood that she had not been saved at all. She had simply been claimed. Elena did not know how long she remained on the cold stone floor of the great hall after the Count vanished. Time seemed to lose meaning in the castle's oppressive darkness, stretching and contracting like something alive. Her tears had dried on her cheeks, leaving trails of salt that stung her skin, and her knees ached from kneeling on the unforgiving stone. But she could not bring herself to rise, could not force her trembling legs to support her weight. She was alive. Against all reason, against everything she had expected, she was still breathing. But at what cost? A sound broke through her paralysis, the soft shuffle of footsteps approaching from somewhere in the shadows. Elena's head snapped up, her heart hammering against her ribs. Had the Count returned to finish what he had begun? Had he changed his mind about sparing her? A figure emerged from the darkness, but it was not the Count. It was a man, or at least something that had once been a man. He was ancient, his back bent with the weight of years uncounted, his face a landscape of deep wrinkles and liver spots. He wore the livery of a servant, black and silver, though the fabric was worn thin and patched in places. In his gnarled hands, he carried a silver candelabra, its 3 candles providing a weak circle of light that barely pushed back the shadows. His eyes, roomy and grey, fixed upon Elena with a mixture of pity and resignation that chilled her more thoroughly than the castle's cold air. "Miss," he said, his voice creaking like an old door, "you must come with me. The master has ordered chambers prepared for you." Eleanor stared at him, unable to process his words. Chambers, as though she were truly a guest rather than a prisoner awaiting execution. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper. "I am called Vasile," the old man said, and Elena felt a shock of recognition at the name, the same as the man who had driven her cart, the same as her own family name. "I have served the master for longer than I care to remember. Come, miss. It is not wise to linger in the great hall after dark." "It is already dark," Elena said. A ghost of a smile touched the old servant's lips. "There are degrees of darkness in this place, miss. The darkness of evening is nothing compared to what comes later. Please, follow me." Elena forced herself to stand, her legs shaking beneath her. She clutched her grandmother's cross so tightly that its edges cut into her palm, drawing blood that welled up dark in the candlelight. The old servant noticed but said nothing, merely turning and beginning to walk toward the staircase the Count had descended earlier. Elena followed, because there was nothing else to do. They climbed the stairs in silence, the old man's labored breathing and the whisper of Elena's dress against stone the only sounds. The candelabra cast dancing shadows on the walls, and Elena tried not to look too closely at the tapestries they passed, tried not to see the scenes of carnage and suffering woven into the ancient fabric with terrible skill. The staircase seemed to go on forever, winding up through the heart of the castle like a spiral into hell itself. Eleanor's calves burned with the effort of climbing, and her breath came in short gasps in the thin, cold air. Still the old servant pressed on, never pausing, never looking back. Finally, they emerged into a corridor lined with doors. The walls here were bare stone, damp with moisture that gleamed in the candlelight like sweat. The old servant stopped before one of the doors, heavy oak bound with iron, and produced an enormous key from somewhere within his coat. The lock turned with a groan that echoed down the corridor, and the door swung inward to reveal a chamber beyond. Elena stepped inside and felt her breath catch in her throat. The room was enormous, easily 3 times the size of her entire cottage in Veleni. A canopied bed dominated the far wall, its curtains deep crimson velvet that pooled on the floor like spilled blood. A fireplace took up most of another wall, its hearth cold and dark, but stacked with wood, waiting to be lit. Tapestries covered the remaining walls, these ones less horrific than those below, depicting scenes of forests and mountains and night skies filled with stars that seemed almost to twinkle in the flickering candlelight. A wardrobe stood in one corner, its doors carved with intricate designs of roses and thorns. A vanity occupied another corner, its mirror covered with a black cloth. And in the center of the room, a small table had been set with food, bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a carafe of deep red wine. It was a room fit for a lady of nobility, not a prisoner, not a sacrifice. "The master wishes you to be comfortable," the old servant said, moving about the room to light additional candles placed in sconces on the walls. As light bloomed, Elena could see more details. The richness of the fabrics, the quality of the furniture, the care with which everything had been arranged. "Comfortable," Elena repeated numbly, "until he kills me." The old servant paused in his work, his back to her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, "The master has not killed anyone in this castle for 3 years, miss. Not since the last tribute." Elena felt ice settle in her stomach. The last tribute. What happened to them? "She lived here for 6 months, the old servant said, still not turning. "The master fed from her, but never enough to kill. He kept her comfortable, even kind in his own way. Then one night she tried to escape. Now he did turn, and his eyes held a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. She made it as far as the forest. The wolves found her before dawn." "The wolves," Elena whispered. "The master's wolves. They obey his will absolutely. No one leaves this castle without his permission, miss. Not the living, at least." The old servant moved to the fireplace and began arranging kindling. "I tell you this not to frighten you, but so you understand. This room may be gilded, but it is still a cage." He struck flint to steel, and flame caught in the kindling. Within moments, fire was crackling in the hearth, its warmth beginning to push back the chill that had settled into Elena's bones. "Why do you stay?" Elena asked. "If you have served him so long, surely you must hate him. Why not flee?" The old servant straightened with difficulty, his joints cracking audibly. He looked at Elena with eyes that held centuries of weariness. "Because I am bound to him, miss. By oath and by blood and by something far older than either. I was the first tribute, you see. 200 years ago I was a young man who thought he could bargain with the devil." He smiled bitterly. "I asked the master to spare my village, and he agreed, on the condition that I serve him for all eternity. I thought eternity was just a word. I did not understand that he meant it literally." Elena stared at him in horror. "You've been here for 200 years. 217 come spring, though I stopped counting decades ago." He moved toward the door, his steps heavy with exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical weariness. "Eat, miss. Sleep if you can. The master will send for you when he wishes to see you again. Until then, this room is yours." "Wait," Elena called as he reached the threshold. "What should I call you? If we share a name, it will become confusing." The old servant paused, and for a moment, something like warmth touched his weathered face. "My friends called me Vasile. The master calls me servant. You may call me whichever you prefer, miss." "Then I will call you Vasile," Elena said softly, as a friend would. The old man's eyes glistened in the candlelight. He nodded once, then stepped through the door and closed it behind him. Elena heard the key turn in the lock, the sound of it final as a coffin nail being driven home. She was alone. Elena stood in the center of the room for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened to her. Hours ago, she had been preparing for death. She had made peace with her mortality, had accepted that her life would end in violence and pain. She had been ready. But this gilded prison, this mockery of hospitality, was worse than any death she could have imagined, because now she had to live with the knowledge that her sacrifice had accomplished nothing. The Count had spared her, not out of mercy but out of curiosity. She was a toy to him, a curiosity to be studied and eventually discarded, and there was no escape. Elena walked to the table and looked down at the food. Her stomach growled. She had not eaten since morning, and her body's needs cared nothing for her spiritual anguish. She picked up a piece of bread and bit into it. It was fresh, soft, nothing like the coarse brown bread of the village. It tasted like ashes in her mouth, but she forced herself to swallow. She would need her strength, for what she did not know, but she would need it nonetheless. As she ate mechanically, Eleanor's eyes were drawn to the covered mirror. She set down the bread and walked to the vanity, her hand reaching out to pull away the black cloth. "I would not do that if I were you." Eleanor spun around with a gasp, her heart leaping into her throat. The Count stood in the center of the room, as though he had materialized from the shadows themselves. She had not heard him enter, had not heard the door open or close. He simply was, solid and real and terrifying. "The mirrors in this castle show truths that are better left unseen," he continued, his blood-red eyes fixed upon her. "For your own peace of mind, leave it covered." Elena's hand dropped to her side. She pressed her back against the vanity, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the Count, though she knew it was futile. If he wished to take her, no amount of distance would save her. "Why are you here?" she asked, proud that her voice only trembled slightly. "This is my castle. I go where I please." The Count moved closer, his steps silent on the stone floor. He had changed his clothing, or perhaps he had not, and Eleanor simply had not noticed the details before. He wore a coat of deep burgundy over a black waistcoat and trousers, all of it perfectly tailored to his tall frame. At his throat, a cravat was fixed with a silver pin in the shape of a bat. "You know what I meant," Elena said. A slight smile touched the Count's lips, though it did not reach his eyes. "I came to see how you were settling into your accommodations. Vasile can be somewhat terse in his explanations. I wish to ensure you understood the nature of your situation." "I am a prisoner," Elena said flatly. "What else is there to understand?" "You are a guest," the Count corrected, though his tone suggested he did not believe it any more than she did. "A guest who will remain here for as long as I deem it appropriate. You will be provided with food, shelter, comfort. You will want for nothing material, except freedom." "Except freedom," he agreed. "But then, what is freedom truly? Is the peasant in Valeni free when she spends every day in fear of starvation, of disease, of the countless ways a mortal life can be cut short? At least here, you need fear nothing but me." Eleanor met his gaze directly, though it cost her dearly. "And that is the greatest fear of all." The Count's smile widened fractionally. "You are not as meek as you appear, Elena Vasile. There is steel beneath that pious exterior. I find myself intrigued." He circled her slowly, exactly as he had done in the great hall, and Elena forced herself to remain still. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower. "Tell me," the Count said, his voice soft as silk, "why did you truly volunteer? And do not give me that noble speech about sacrifice. I have lived too long to believe in selfless virtue. Everyone has a reason, a selfish core beneath the pretty words. What was yours?" Eleanor swallowed hard. She thought of lying, of maintaining the fiction that she was purely noble, purely good. But she had already told him one truth tonight, that she feared death, and he had seemed to respect her honesty. "I was tired," she said quietly. "Tired of living in fear, tired of watching people die and being unable to save them. Tired of waiting for death to come for me, as it had come for everyone I loved." She closed her eyes. "At least this way, I could choose the manner of my dying. At least this way it would mean something." When she opened her eyes, the Count had stopped circling. He stood before her, his expression unreadable. "You sought death," he said slowly, "not to save others, but to escape the pain of living." "Yes," Elena whispered. "Is that so terrible?" "No." The word was barely audible. "It is the most honest thing you have said." The Count reached out and took her hand, the one still clutching her grandmother's cross, and gently pried open her fingers. The cross fell away, and he studied the cuts it had left in her palm, the blood that welled in the creases of her skin. His eyes fixed on that blood with an intensity that made Eleanor's breath catch. "You are hurt," he said, his voice strained. "It's nothing," Elena managed. "It is blood." The Count's thumb traced the edge of one cut, not quite touching. "Your blood, pure and untainted, and—" He trailed off, and for a moment, Elena saw something flicker across his face. Hunger, yes, but also something that looked almost like pain. Then he released her hand and stepped back abruptly. "You should tend to that wound," he said, his voice once more cold and controlled. "There is water in the basin, bandages in the wardrobe. See to it." Eleanor pressed her wounded hand against her dress, feeling her own blood seep into the white fabric, staining it red. "Why do you care if I'm hurt?" The Count turned away from her, his shoulders tense beneath his coat. Because you are mine to protect now, Elena Vasile, and I do not allow what is mine to come to harm, except by your own hand. Except by my own hand, he agreed softly. A long silence stretched between them. The fire crackled in the hearth, and somewhere in the distance Elena could hear the wind howling through the castle's towers. It sounded like voices crying out in anguish, like souls trapped between worlds. "Did you love her?" Elena asked suddenly. "The last tribute, the woman who tried to escape." The Count went very still. "Why do you ask?" "Because you let her live for 6 months. You fed from her but did not kill her. That suggests you found some value in her life beyond mere sustenance." The Count was silent for so long that Elena thought he would not answer. Then, quietly, "I found her company, less unbearable than solitude. That is not love. But when she died, did you mourn?" "I do not mourn," the Count said, his voice hard as iron. "Mourning requires a soul, and I lost mine centuries ago." Elena stepped forward, drawn by an impulse she did not fully understand. "I don't believe that." The Count spun to face her, and his eyes blazed with sudden fury. "You know nothing of what I am, girl. You know nothing of the things I have done, the lives I have taken, the darkness I have embraced. I am damned beyond redemption, beyond salvation, beyond any hope of—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw clenching. Elena could see a muscle working in his cheek, could see the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "If you had no soul," Elena said softly, "you would not be capable of anger. You would not be capable of pain. You would simply be empty. But you are not empty. You are full of rage and sorrow and something that looks very much like regret." "Enough." The word cracked through the air like a whip. "You will not psychoanalyze me, Elena Vasile. You will not attempt to find humanity in a monster. I am what I am, and no amount of naive optimism will change that." "I'm not trying to change you," Elena said. "I'm simply trying to understand you." "Why?" The Count's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Why would you wish to understand the creature who holds your life in his hands? Why not simply hate me as you should?" Elena met his gaze, and for the first time since entering the castle, she did not feel afraid. She felt something else, something dangerous and confusing and utterly unexpected. Pity, not for herself, but for him. "Because hatred is easy," she said, "and I think you have been hated for so long that you have forgotten what it feels like to be seen as anything other than a monster." The Count stared at her for a long, breathless moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. It opened at his approach without him touching it, and he stepped through into the corridor beyond. He paused on the threshold, his back to her. "Sleep, Elena Vasile," he said. "Tomorrow I will show you what it truly means to be a guest in my castle, and perhaps then you will understand why hatred is not easy. It is necessary." The door closed behind him, and Elena heard the lock turn. She stood alone in the gilded chamber, her wounded hand pressed against her chest, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. Elena did not think she would be able to sleep, but exhaustion claimed her the moment she lay down upon the bed. The mattress was soft beyond belief, the pillows filled with down that cradled her head like clouds, and despite everything, despite the fear and the uncertainty and the knowledge that she was a prisoner in a castle ruled by death itself, her body demanded rest. She dreamed of her grandmother. In the dream they sat together in the small cottage in Valeni, the fire crackling in the hearth exactly as it had when Eleanor was a child. Her grandmother's hands moved with practiced ease as she kneaded bread dough, her weathered face peaceful in the firelight. "You always did have too much compassion for your own good," her grandmother said, though Eleanor could not remember speaking. "Even as a child you cried over wounded birds and tried to heal broken things that could not be healed." "Is that wrong?" Eleanor asked, her voice sounding young and uncertain even to her own ears. "Not wrong, child. Dangerous." Her grandmother looked up, and her eyes, dark as Elena's own, held infinite sadness. "Compassion for monsters will be your undoing. You cannot save what does not wish to be saved." "But what if he does wish it?" Elena heard herself say. "What if he simply doesn't know how?" Her grandmother's hands stilled in the dough. "Then he will drag you down into the darkness with him, and you will both be lost." "Perhaps being lost together is better than being alone," Elena whispered. Her grandmother sighed and returned to her kneading. "You are your mother's daughter. She too loved things that could not love her back. It killed her in the end." "My mother died in childbirth," Elena protested. "Did she?" Her grandmother's voice was sad. "Or did she die of a broken heart long before and simply did not lay down her body until you were born?" Eleanor woke with tears on her cheeks, and the memory of her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. Morning light, pale and grey, filtered through the chamber's single window, illuminating the room in shades of silver and shadow. She rose from the bed and went to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtain to look out upon the world beyond her prison. The view stole her breath. The castle perched on the edge of a cliff so sheer that Elena could not see the bottom. Below, a sea of mist rolled and churned like ocean waves, obscuring the valleys and forests that must lie far beneath. In the distance, the Carpathian Mountains rose like the spine of some sleeping titan, their peaks touched with early snow that gleamed in the weak sunlight. It was beautiful, terribly, heartbreakingly beautiful, and utterly unreachable. A knock at the door made Elena turn. Before she could respond, the door opened, and old Vasile entered, carrying a tray laden with breakfast, more bread, cold meat, cheese, and a pot of something that steamed and smelled of herbs. "Good morning, miss," he said, setting the tray on the table. "I trust you slept well?" "As well as could be expected," Elena replied. She watched as the old servant moved about the room, stoking the fire, opening the wardrobe to reveal dresses hanging within, none of which belonged to her. "The master has requested your presence in the library after you have eaten and made yourself presentable," Vasile said. "He wishes to speak with you." Elena's stomach tightened with apprehension. "And if I refuse? Then he will come here instead, and I suspect you would prefer to meet him in a neutral location." Vasile gestured to the wardrobe. "These dresses belong to the last tribute. The master had them cleaned and mended. They should fit you well enough." Elena walked to the wardrobe and pulled out one of the dresses. Deep blue velvet with long sleeves and a high collar. It was far finer than anything she had ever worn, the kind of dress a noblewoman might wear to court. "I don't want to wear her clothes," Elena said quietly. "Nevertheless, your own dress is hardly appropriate for breakfast with the master," Vasile replied, his tone not unkind. "I will return in 1 hour to escort you to the library. Please be ready." He left before Elena could protest further. Elena ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her mind racing with questions she could not answer. What did the Count want with her? Why had he spared her? And why, despite everything, did she feel drawn to understand him? When she had finished eating, she reluctantly approached the wardrobe and selected the simplest dress she could find, grey wool with minimal ornamentation. It fit her perfectly, as though it had been made for her body, and she tried not to think about the woman who had worn it before, the woman who had tried to escape and died for it. She braided her hair and pinned it back, then retrieved her grandmother's cross from where it had fallen the night before. She clasped it around her neck, the familiar weight of it a small comfort. When Vasile returned, he nodded approvingly at her appearance and gestured for her to follow. They walked through corridors that seemed to shift and change when Elena was not looking directly at them. She tried to memorize the route, left at the tapestry of the bleeding saint, right at the statue of the weeping angel, straight through the gallery where portraits of long-dead nobles watched with painted eyes. But it was hopeless. The castle seemed alive, seemed to resist being known. Finally, they stopped before a set of double doors carved with intricate designs of ivy and roses. Vasile pushed them open to reveal a library beyond. Elena stepped inside and felt her breath catch. The room was enormous, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with shelves that groaned beneath the weight of thousands of books. A rolling ladder provided access to the upper shelves, and scattered throughout the space were chairs and small tables for reading. At the far end, floor-to-ceiling windows looked out upon the mountains, flooding the room with pale morning light. And in the center of it all, seated in a high-backed chair with a book open on his lap, sat Count Dracula. He looked up as Elena entered, and something flickered in his blood-red eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or approval. "Elena Vasile," he said, closing the book and setting it aside. "I am pleased you accepted my invitation." "Did I have a choice?" Elena asked. "No," the Count admitted, "but I appreciate the illusion of civility nonetheless." He gestured to a chair across from his own. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss." Elena moved forward on legs that felt like water. She sat in the indicated chair, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to run to. The Count studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving over her face with an intensity that made Elena's skin prickle. "You wish to understand me," he said finally. "Very well, I will grant you that wish. Though I warn you, Elena Vasile, understanding often brings more pain than ignorance. Are you certain you wish to proceed?" Elena thought of her grandmother's warning in the dream. She thought of the woman who had died trying to escape. She thought of all the reasons she should say no, should retreat into ignorance, and simply wait for whatever fate the Count had planned for her. But she was tired of fear, tired of not knowing, tired of being passive in her own story. "Yes," she said firmly. "I wish to understand." The Count smiled. A real smile this time, though it was tinged with something that looked like sorrow. "Then let us begin," he said, "with the story of how a man becomes a monster." The Count rose from his chair with fluid grace and walked to the windows, his hands clasped behind his back. The pale morning light touched his face, and Elena could see that it did not harm him as the legends claimed. He did not burst into flame or crumble to ash. He simply stood there, his profile sharp against the brightness, looking out at the mountains as though searching for something he had lost long ago. "What do you know of me?" he asked without turning. "What stories do the villagers tell their children to keep them obedient and afraid?" Elena chose her words carefully. "They say you were once a great warrior, that you fought against the Ottoman Empire to protect Christendom, that you were betrayed and murdered, and rose from the grave with a thirst for blood that can never be satisfied." "A tidy summary," the Count said, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "And like all legends, it contains just enough truth to be dangerous, and just enough fiction to be meaningless." He turned to face her, and the morning light made his pale skin seem almost translucent. "Would you like to know the real story, Elena Vasile, or would you prefer to cling to the comfort of your simple myths?" "I want the truth," Elena said. The Count's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Very well, but remember, you asked for this." He began to pace slowly before the windows, his movements measured and deliberate, as though he were walking through memories that still had the power to wound him. "I was born Vlad Dracula in the year 1431, the son of Vlad Dracul, voivode of Wallachia. My father was a member of the Order of the Dragon, sworn to defend Christendom against the Ottoman threat. From the time I could walk, I was raised to be a warrior. I learned to ride before I could read. I learned to kill before I learned to love." He paused, his gaze distant. "When I was 11 years old, my father sent me and my younger brother Radu to the Ottoman court as hostages, a political arrangement to ensure our father's continued loyalty. We were prisoners, though they called us guests. We were educated in the ways of the Ottomans, taught their language, their customs, their faith. They wanted to convert us, to make us forget we were Christian princes." Elena listened in silence, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "Radu embraced them," the Count continued, and there was something raw in his voice now. "He converted willingly, took their ways as his own, even took their men to his bed. But I," his hands clenched into fists, "I resisted. I refused to bow. Every day was a battle to maintain my identity, my faith, my very soul. They beat me for my defiance. They starved me. They locked me in darkness and told me that Christian God had abandoned me. But you survived," Elena whispered. "I survived," the Count agreed, "and in surviving something inside me changed. Something hardened and twisted. I learned that mercy was weakness. I learned that cruelty was the only language power understood. I learned that to survive in this world, one must become a monster, or be devoured by them." He turned away from the window and moved to a nearby shelf, pulling down a leather-bound volume so old its spine cracked at his touch. "When I finally returned to Wallachia at the age of 17, my father and my eldest brother had been murdered, betrayed by the boyars, the nobles who were supposed to serve them. I was alone except for Radu, and he had chosen the Ottomans over his own blood." The Count opened the book, though Elena suspected he was not really seeing the pages. "So I did what I had been trained to do. I fought. I killed. I took back my throne by force and held it through fear." "They called you the Impaler," Elena said quietly. The Count's expression did not change. "Yes, I impaled my enemies, thousands of them, boyars who had betrayed my family, Ottoman invaders who threatened my people, thieves and traitors, and anyone who dared challenge my authority. I created forests of the dead, their bodies rotting on stakes as a warning to all who would oppose me." Elena felt her stomach turn, but she forced herself to keep listening. "I told myself I was protecting my people, that every atrocity I committed was necessary to keep Wallachia safe from the Ottoman tide. I told myself I was serving God, that my cruelty was righteous." The Count's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I told myself many lies in those years." He closed the book and set it aside, then moved to stand before Elena's chair. He looked down at her with eyes that held centuries of pain. "But the truth, Elena Vasile, is that I became what I hated. I became the monster I had sworn to destroy, and when death finally came for me, when I was betrayed and murdered by those I had tried to protect, I did not go quietly into whatever afterlife awaited me. What happened? Elena asked, though part of her did not want to know. The Count's expression became distant, haunted. I made a bargain. As I lay dying, my blood seeping into the earth, I called out not to God, but to something far older, something that had been waiting in the darkness since before the church built its first stone. I offered my soul in exchange for the power to continue my war, to punish those who had betrayed me, to never again be at the mercy of mortal weakness. And it answered, Elena breathed. It answered, the Count confirmed. I rose from my grave 3 days later, a mockery of resurrection, a twisted mirror of the Christ I had once worshipped. I was stronger than any mortal man. I could not be killed by conventional means. I did not age, I did not tire. But the price— He turned away from her, his shoulders tense. The price was everything that had made me human. I could no longer walk in the light of day without pain. I could no longer consume normal food or drink. I could no longer feel warmth, could no longer know the simple pleasures of mortal existence. And worst of all, I was consumed by a hunger that could only be satisfied by the blood of the living. Elena sat very still, processing his words. You fed on your own people. At first, yes, the Count admitted. I told myself I was only taking the guilty, the criminals, the traitors, those who deserved punishment. But hunger is not concerned with justice, Elena. Hunger simply is. And as the years passed, as the decades turned to centuries, I found it harder and harder to remember why I should care whether my victims were guilty or innocent. He moved to a cabinet in the corner and poured himself a glass of dark red liquid from a crystal decanter. He held it up to the light, studying it. This is wine, he said, 50 years old, worth more than most peasants earn in a lifetime. I can drink it, but I taste nothing. I feel nothing. It might as well be water. He set the glass down untouched. The only thing I can truly taste, the only sensation that penetrates the numbness of eternal existence, is blood. Fresh blood, still warm from a living body. That is my only pleasure now, my only connection to what I once was. Elena found herself speaking before she could stop herself. Then why not simply end it? Why continue to exist if existence brings you no joy? The Count laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Do you think I have not tried? I have stood in sunlight and felt my skin burn. I have driven stakes through my own heart. I have thrown myself from cliffs and drowned myself in rivers. But the curse that sustains me is stronger than any desire for death. I am trapped, Elena, trapped in this body, in this castle, in this endless cycle of hunger and feeding and hollow existence. The only thing I can choose is how much suffering I inflict before the next dawn. He returned to his chair and sat heavily, suddenly looking more tired than Elena had ever seen him. For centuries, I told myself I was still serving some greater purpose. I punished the wicked. I maintained order through fear. I convinced myself that my existence, however monstrous, still had meaning. He met Elena's gaze, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart ache. But 3 years ago, I finally admitted the truth to myself. I am not a guardian or a protector. I am simply a parasite feeding on life because I am too cursed to die and too cowardly to stop. The silence that followed was absolute. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the wind howling outside the windows, could hear the ancient wood of the library creaking around them. Why are you telling me this? She finally asked. The Count leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Because you asked to understand me. Because you looked at me with pity rather than hatred, and I find I cannot bear that pity if it is based on ignorance. I want you to know what I am, Elena Vasile. Not the legend, not the myth. The truth of what stands before you, a creature so far removed from humanity that he can barely remember what it felt like to have a soul. Elena's throat was tight, her eyes burning with unshed tears, not for herself but for him, for the man he had been before the world had broken him, for the warrior who had fought for his faith and his people, only to be betrayed and transformed into the very monster he had sworn to destroy. You still have a soul, she said softly. The Count's eyes snapped to hers, blazing with sudden intensity. Do not presume to know what I have or do not have. If you had no soul, you would feel no regret. You would feel no pain at what you have become. You would simply exist and feed and feel nothing. Elena leaned forward in her chair. But you feel everything, don't you? Every death, every drop of blood. Every moment of your existence is agony, because you remember what you once were, and you can see the vast distance between that man and what you are now. The Count stood abruptly, his chair scraping back across the stone floor. You speak of things you do not understand. Then help me understand, Eleanor pressed. If you truly felt nothing, why did you spare me? Why did you spare the last tribute for 6 months? Why do you keep old Vasile alive when you could simply drain him and be done with it? Because I am selfish, the Count snarled. Because eternity is long and silence is worse than the company of prisoners. Because I am too weak to embrace complete isolation. Or because you still crave connection, Elena said. Because somewhere beneath the hunger and the darkness, you are still human enough to feel lonely. The Count crossed the distance between them in an instant, moving faster than Eleanor's eyes could follow. He seized her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her flesh with barely restrained strength, his face inches from her own. I am not human, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I have not been human for 5 centuries. I am a monster, Elena Vasile, a predator. And if you forget that for even a moment, I will drain you dry and feel nothing but the satisfaction of hunger, appeased. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, even as fear raced through her veins like ice water. Then do it. Prove to me that you are nothing but hunger. Prove that there is no humanity left in you. For a long, breathless moment, the Count simply stared at her. She could feel the tension in his body, could see the war raging behind his eyes, the beast struggling against something deeper, something that still remembered what it meant to be a man. Then slowly, his grip on her shoulders loosened, his hands fell away, and he stepped back as though she had burned him. You are either very brave or very foolish, he said hoarsely. I think we've established that I'm both, Elena replied, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the trembling in her limbs. The Count turned away from her and walked back to the windows. He stood there in silence for so long that Elena began to wonder if their conversation was over, if he would simply dismiss her back to her gilded cage. But then he spoke, his voice so quiet, she had to strain to hear it. Her name was Marina. Elena's breath caught. The last tribute? Yes. The Count's reflection in the window was ghostly, insubstantial. She was beautiful and terrified and desperately trying to be brave. She reminded me of someone I had known long ago, a woman from my mortal life, before I became this. I kept her alive because I enjoyed her fear, or so I told myself. I fed from her just enough to keep her weak, to keep her dependent on me. I gave her fine clothes and books and told myself I was being merciful. What was she really? Eleanor asked gently. A distraction, a way to mark the passage of time, something to focus on other than the endless emptiness of my existence. The Count's hands clenched at his sides. After 6 months she tried to escape. She waited until I was in my day sleep and picked the lock on her door, clever girl. She made it all the way to the forest before my wolves caught her scent. Did you order them to kill her? No. The word was barely audible. They acted on instinct, protecting what they perceived as mine. By the time I woke and realized she had fled, it was already over. I found her body in the woods, torn apart, her eyes still open in terror. Elena felt tears spill down her cheeks. I'm sorry. Do not weep for her, the Count said harshly. She is at peace now. The dead are always more fortunate than those who must continue to exist. I'm not weeping for her, Elena said. I'm weeping for you. Because you cared enough to remember her name, because her death still pains you even now, because you are not the unfeeling monster you pretend to be. The Count spun to face her, and Elena saw that his composure was cracking, that something in her words had struck deep. What do you want from me? He demanded. Why do you insist on seeing humanity where none exists? Why do you torture me with these reminders of what I have lost? Eleanor stood, her legs unsteady, but her resolve firm. Because I think you want to be seen. Not as the legend, not as the monster, but as the man you still are, beneath everything. There is no man beneath, the Count said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then prove it. Eleanor took a step toward him. Show me the monster. Show me the creature who feels nothing, who cares for nothing, who exists only to feed and destroy. The Count's eyes blazed red. You do not know what you are asking. Don't I? Eleanor took another step, her heart pounding but her feet steady. I came here prepared to die. I am still prepared to die. So show me the truth of what you are. The Count moved toward her with inhuman speed, closing the distance in the space of a heartbeat. He seized her face in his cold hands, tilting her head back, exposing the vulnerable line of her throat. Elena felt his breath, cold as a winter grave against her skin, felt the press of those sharp teeth just barely touching the pulse point beneath her jaw. She did not struggle, did not scream. She simply looked up into his eyes and waited for 3 heartbeats, 4, 5. They remained frozen like that. Predator and prey, monster and maiden, darkness and light, poised on the edge of destruction. Then the Count released her and stumbled backward as though she had struck him. "I cannot," he whispered, and there was such anguish in his voice that Elena's heart broke for him. "God help me, I cannot." Elena raised a trembling hand to her throat, feeling the slight indentations where his teeth had pressed but not broken skin. "Why?" The Count turned away from her, his shoulders shaking. "Because when I look at you, I see something I destroyed in myself so long ago that I thought it was lost forever. I see innocence, compassion, the belief that there is still good in this world worth protecting." His voice cracked. "I see everything I once was, everything I sacrificed in my quest for power and vengeance, and I cannot destroy that. Not again." Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation like ice cracking in spring thaw, like the first breath after nearly drowning. She walked to where the Count stood, and before she could think better of it, placed her hand on his arm. He flinched at her touch but did not pull away. "You have not destroyed it," she said softly. "It still exists, in you. You simply forgot how to see it." The Count looked down at her hand on his arm, the first willing, gentle touch he had felt in how long? Decades? Centuries? "You should fear me," he said hoarsely. "You should hate me." "I know," Elena replied, "but I don't." "You are a fool." "Yes," she agreed. "A fool who has seen something in you that you've hidden even from yourself." The Count raised his hand as though to touch her face, then stopped himself. His fingers hovered in the air between them, trembling with the effort of restraint. "If I touch you," he whispered, "I will not want to stop. If I allow myself to feel anything for you, I will become something even more dangerous than I already am. Do you understand? My hunger will twist whatever affection I feel into possession. My love, if such a word can even apply to what I am capable of, will be suffocating and destructive and ultimately fatal to you." Elena looked up at him, at this creature of darkness who was fighting so desperately against his own nature, and made a decision that she knew would alter the course of whatever remained of her life. "Then we will face that together," she said. The Count's eyes widened. "Together? You have been alone for so long that you have forgotten there is another way," Elena said. "You have existed in isolation, feeding your hunger and your guilt in equal measure, with no one to remind you that you are more than your darkest impulses. But I am here now, and I am not afraid of your darkness because I have seen the light that still flickers within it. That light will die," the Count said, but there was a desperate hope in his voice that he could not quite hide. "You will corrupt it, or I will consume it, and you will end up as Marina did, broken and destroyed." "Perhaps," Elena acknowledged, "or perhaps together we will find a way for both of us to survive, for you to exist without becoming the monster you fear, and for me to live with purpose beyond simply waiting for death." The Count stared at her for a long moment, and Elena could see the war raging in his expression, hope battling against centuries of cynicism, the desperate wish to believe struggling against the certainty of disappointment. Finally he spoke. "What you are proposing is madness." "Then we are both mad," Elena said. A ghost of a smile touched the Count's lips, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger, less like a marble statue and more like a man who had known joy once upon a time. "Very well," he said softly. "We will attempt this experiment. But I warn you, Elena Vasile, I am not a fairy tale prince waiting to be redeemed by true love's kiss. I am a monster with a monster's nature. I will hurt you, whether I intend to or not. I will disappoint you. I will fail to be whatever ideal you have constructed in your mind." "I know," Elena said, "and I am not the pure saint you seem to think I am. I have doubts and fears and darkness of my own. I will frustrate you. I will question you. I will push against the boundaries of this prison you have built around yourself." The Count's smile widened fractionally. "Then we understand each other." "Perhaps we are beginning to," Elena agreed. The Count finally allowed his hand to complete its journey, his cold fingers gently cupping Elena's cheek. She did not flinch from his touch, though his skin was like ice against her warmth. "You are extraordinary," he whispered, "and I am terrified of what I might do to you." "Then be terrified," Elena said, "but don't let fear make your decisions for you. You have spent centuries being ruled by hunger and guilt. Perhaps it is time to let something else guide you." "And what would that be?" Elena placed her hand over his, feeling the coldness of his flesh, the absence of a pulse beneath his skin. "Hope." The word hung in the air between them like a prayer. The Count closed his eyes, and Elena saw something that shocked her. A single tear, red as blood, sliding down his pale cheek. "I have not felt hope in 500 years, he said, his voice breaking. "I do not remember how." "Then I will remember for both of us," Elena said, "until you remember for yourself." The Count opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression so raw, so vulnerable, that Elena's breath caught in her throat. Then, slowly, hesitantly, as though he were performing an action he had forgotten the mechanics of, he leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers. They stood like that in the morning light, two lost souls finding unexpected shelter in each other's presence, a monster learning to hope, and a saint learning that redemption was not always simple or safe or certain. Outside the windows, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and somewhere in the depths of the castle, old Vasile paused in his endless tasks and smiled, remembering what it felt like to witness the beginning of something that might, just might, be miraculous. Or it might be the beginning of a tragedy that would consume them both. Only time would tell which story this would become. The days that followed were unlike anything Elena could have imagined. The castle, which had seemed a place of absolute darkness and despair, began to reveal itself in unexpected ways. There were rooms filled with treasures plundered from across Europe, Byzantine icons studded with jewels, Persian carpets woven with threads of gold, paintings by masters whose names Elena did not recognize, but whose talent was undeniable. There were galleries lined with armor and weapons from a dozen different wars, each piece telling a story of blood and conquest, and there were chambers that had been sealed for decades, their doors locked against memories too painful to revisit. The Count, though Elena found herself thinking of him more and more as Vlad, the name he had been born with, became her guide through this labyrinth of history and horror. He showed her the chapel where he had once prayed, now empty and cold, its altar bare of any holy symbols. He showed her the chamber where he had slept his first death, the stone sarcophagus still stained with the earth of his homeland. He showed her the tower where he watched the sunrise from behind thick curtains, close enough to feel the warmth, but unable to step into the light that would bring him agony. And slowly, carefully, they began to learn each other. Elena discovered that the Count had a scholar's mind trapped in a warrior's body. He spoke 7 languages fluently and could read a dozen more. He had lived through the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Enlightenment, and countless other transformations of human civilization. He had read Dante in the original Italian, had corresponded with philosophers and scientists, had watched empires rise and fall like waves upon a shore. "Knowledge is the only immortality worth pursuing," he told her one evening as they sat in the library, Elena with a book of poetry and the Count with a volume of natural philosophy. Power fades. Beauty withers. But ideas persist. They outlive their creators and reshape the world long after flesh has returned to dust. "Is that why you read?" Elena asked. "To feel connected to humanity, even as you prey upon it?" The Count was quiet for a moment, his finger marking his place in the book. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I simply need something to occupy eternity. The mind can consume only so many memories before it begins to devour itself." Elena learned that he could play the piano with extraordinary skill, though he claimed he had not touched the instrument in decades. She convinced him to play for her one night, and the music that poured from his cold fingers was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Compositions by Mozart and Beethoven rendered with technical perfection, but also with an emotional depth that suggested the Count understood suffering in ways the original composers could never have imagined. "You should play more often," Elena said when he finished, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Music is for the living," the Count replied, closing the piano's lid with finality. "It celebrates joy and sorrow, love and loss, all things that require a beating heart to truly feel. I am merely mimicking emotions I no longer possess." "I don't believe that," Elena said. "I heard the grief in those notes. I heard longing and regret and something that sounded very much like hope." The Count looked at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "You hear what you wish to hear, Elena Vasile. You project your own humanity onto me and mistake my shadows for light. Or perhaps you have been in darkness so long that you have forgotten what light looks like when it shines from within you," Elena countered. These conversations became the rhythm of their days, gentle battles of philosophy and theology, debates about the nature of the soul and whether redemption was possible for those who had committed unforgivable sins. The Count argued that he was beyond saving, that some stains ran too deep to ever be cleansed. Elena insisted that no one was beyond hope, that even the darkest night eventually gave way to dawn, You speak like a priest, the Count said one afternoon as they walked through one of the castle's overgrown courtyards. All faith and optimism, with no understanding of how cruel the world truly is. And you speak like a man who has forgotten that cruelty is not the only truth, Elena replied. She bent to examine a rose that had somehow survived in the courtyard's neglected garden, a single bloom of deep red among thorns and withered leaves. This rose grows here despite the cold, despite the darkness, despite every reason it should have died. Is that not a kind of miracle? The Count looked at the flower, and something flickered across his face. It is an accident of nature, a stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable. Or it is proof that life finds a way even in the most hostile conditions, Elena said, carefully plucking the rose. She turned to the Count, and before he could protest, tucked it into the buttonhole of his coat. Perhaps that is what I am, a stubborn rose refusing to accept that this place is only death. The Count stared down at the flower against the black fabric of his coat, and Elena could have sworn she saw the corner of his mouth twitch upward in something that might have been a smile. But there were darker moments too, times when the hunger became too great, and the Count would disappear for hours, returning with that terrible emptiness in his eyes that spoke of blood drunk and lives taken. He never told Elena where he went or whom he fed upon, but she could see the guilt that shadowed him afterward, the way he avoided her gaze as though ashamed of what he had done. I cannot stop, he told her one night after such an absence. They sat in her chamber, the fire burning low, and the Count looked more tired than she had ever seen him. I have tried. God knows I have tried. But the hunger is not something I can simply resist through willpower. It is woven into the very fabric of my being. Without blood I grow weak, and the weakness brings madness. Then feed, Elena said quietly, but perhaps not always on those who have no choice in the matter. The Count's eyes snapped to hers. What are you suggesting? Elena met his gaze steadily, though her heart raced with the audacity of what she was about to propose. I am suggesting that you feed from me. The Count stood so abruptly that his chair crashed backward. Absolutely not. Why not? Elena rose as well, moving to stand before him. You say the hunger drives you to hunt innocents in the villages below. If you fed from me instead, those lives would be spared. And what of your life? The Count demanded, his voice harsh. Do you understand what you are offering? Each time I feed from you, I take a piece of your mortality, your strength, your will. Eventually, there would be nothing left of Elena Vasile but an empty husk, and I would have consumed yet another innocent soul. Not if you take only what you need and no more, Elena argued. You have lived for centuries. Surely you have learned control. Control is not the same as abstinence, the Count said bitterly. When I taste blood, especially blood as pure as yours, the beast inside me demands everything. It wants to drain you dry, to feel your heart slow and stop beneath my lips, to take all that warmth and life and make it mine. I cannot trust myself to stop once I begin. Elena stepped closer, close enough to feel the cold that radiated from his body. Then I will trust for both of us. I will remind you to stop. I will pull away if necessary, but I will not watch you torture yourself with guilt over the lives you take when there is another option. This is madness, the Count whispered. But there was a desperate hunger in his eyes now, not just for blood, but for the possibility she was offering, the possibility of feeding without destroying, of satisfying his nature without surrendering completely to the beast. We have already established that we are both mad, Elena said, echoing her words from days before. What is one more madness between us? The Count raised his hand to her face, his cold fingers trembling as they traced the line of her jaw. If I hurt you, then you hurt me, Elena said simply. But at least give me the choice. At least let me offer this freely, rather than have you steal it from some terrified villager who has no understanding of what you are. For a long moment, the Count simply looked at her, and Elena could see the war raging behind his eyes. The hunger, the fear, the desperate hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this could work. Finally he spoke, his voice barely audible. Not tonight. I fed recently, and the hunger is not yet strong enough to risk it. But when the time comes, when I can feel the madness beginning to creep in, I will come to you. And if you have changed your mind, if you have realized the foolishness of this offer, I will not hold it against you. I will not change my mind, Elena said. The Count's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. You say that now, when the reality is still abstract. Let us see if your conviction remains when you are faced with the truth of what I am. That night, Elena lay awake in her bed, listening to the wind howl through the castle's towers, and wondering if she had just made the bravest or most foolish decision of her life. Probably both, she decided. She seemed to be developing a talent for brave foolishness. The days continued their strange rhythm. Eleanor explored the castle with increasing confidence, learning its halls and chambers, its shortcuts and secret passages. She discovered a conservatory filled with dead plants in broken pots, and spent an afternoon clearing away the debris and imagining what it might have looked like when it was alive with greenery. She found a music room with instruments from across Europe, all carefully maintained by old Vasile despite no one playing them for decades. She even found a small chapel hidden in one of the castle's most remote towers, its altar still bearing candle stubs and the faint scent of incense. "Did you pray here?" she asked the Count when she told him of her discovery. "Once," he admitted, "long ago, before I understood that God does not listen to the prayers of the damned." "Or perhaps he does," Eleanor suggested gently, "but his answers are not always what we expect." The Count did not respond, but Elena noticed that he stood a little straighter after that conversation, as though some weight he carried had shifted slightly on his shoulders. She also spent time with old Vasile, learning the servant's story in greater detail. He spoke of his wife, who had died of grief when he did not return from the castle. He spoke of his children, who had grown old and died while he remained unchanging, serving the Count out of the magical compulsion that bound him. He spoke of the hundreds of tributes he had seen come to the castle over 2 centuries, some lasting only a night, others surviving for months or even years before death claimed them in one form or another. "What makes you think you will be different?" Vasile asked one afternoon as Elena helped him polish silverware that had not been used in decades. "I don't know if I will be," Elena admitted, "but I know I have to try, because I have seen something in him that I think even he has forgotten exists, and if I can help him remember, then perhaps my life will have meant something beyond simply waiting for death in a small village." Vasile studied her with his rheumy eyes, and something like approval showed in his weathered face. "You are braver than Mirena was. She saw only the monster. You see the man beneath. Whether that makes you wise or foolish, I cannot say. But I hope," his voice cracked slightly, "I hope you succeed where all others have failed, for both your sakes." 2 weeks passed, then 3. Eleanor fell into the rhythm of life in the castle, mornings in the library, afternoons exploring or helping Vasile with his endless tasks, evenings in conversation with the Count. They spoke of philosophy and poetry, of history and science, of all the vast accumulated knowledge that 5 centuries of existence had granted him. And slowly, gradually, Elena began to understand not just the monster he had become, but the man he had been before fate and choice had twisted him into something other. She learned that he had loved once, in his mortal life, a woman named Elisabetta, who had taken her own life when false reports of Vlad's death reached her. That loss had broken something fundamental in him, had planted the seed of darkness that his later choices would cultivate into full damnation. "I told her to wait for me," he said one night as they stood on one of the castle's battlements, looking out at the star-strewn sky. "I promised I would return from the war, but she did not believe. She could not see past her grief to imagine a future where I lived, and so she threw herself from the castle walls, and I returned home to find her body broken on the stones below." "That is a terrible burden to carry," Elena said softly. "It is the burden I deserve," the Count replied. "I was so consumed by revenge after her death that I barely noticed when my own humanity slipped away. I told myself I was honoring her memory by refusing to love again, by embracing cruelty as a shield against further pain. But the truth is, I was simply afraid. Afraid to feel, afraid to be vulnerable, afraid to give my heart to someone who might leave me as she did." Elena took his cold hand in her warm one, and was surprised when he did not pull away. Fear is not the same as absence of love. Sometimes we fear most deeply what we want most desperately. The Count looked down at their joined hands, his pale and cold, hers warm and alive, and something shifted in his expression. "You make me want things I thought I had left behind centuries ago," he said quietly. "Things I have no right to want, no right to even imagine." "Such as," Elena prompted gently, "companionship, understanding, the simple comfort of another's presence without the taint of fear or hunger." He met her eyes. "You." Elena's breath caught. They stood there on the battlements with the wind whipping around them and the stars burning overhead, and she realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer simply prisoner and captor, monster and sacrifice. They had become something far more dangerous. They had become friends. and the space between friendship and something deeper was terrifyingly small. "I want those things too," Elena admitted. "But I am afraid." "Of me?" the Count asked, though he did not sound surprised. "Yes," Elena said honestly, "but also of myself, of what I feel when I am with you, of the way I have begun to care for you despite every rational reason I should not." She looked up at him, at his pale face in the moonlight, at those blood-red eyes that could be so cold, but which now held something warm and vulnerable and almost human. "I am afraid that I am falling in love with you, and I do not know if that love will save us both or destroy us." The Count went very still. For a long moment he simply stared at her, and Elena could not read his expression. Then slowly he raised his free hand to her face, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone capable of such violence. "Elena," he whispered, and her name on his lips was a prayer, and a curse, and a plea all at once. "You should not love me. I am poison. I am damnation. Everything I touch eventually withers and dies." "Perhaps," Elena said, "or perhaps I am the antidote you have been searching for." The Count's thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, and Elena could see the struggle in his face, the desire to pull her close warring with the fear of what that closeness might mean. "I have not kissed anyone since Elisabetta died," he said quietly. 500 years and I have not known the touch of lips upon my own. I told myself it was because I was no longer capable of such tenderness, because the act of kissing requires more humanity than I possess." Elena's heart was hammering so hard, she was certain he could hear it. "And now? Now I find myself wanting to kiss you more than I have wanted anything in centuries," the Count admitted. "But I am afraid that if I start, I will not be able to stop, afraid that the hunger will twist affection into possession, afraid that I will take from you everything you are and leave nothing behind." Elena reached up with her free hand and placed it against his chest, where a human heart would beat. Beneath her palm there was only stillness, the absence of life, the void where warmth should exist. "Then let me be the one to take that risk," she said. "Let me be the one to decide what I am willing to give." "Elena," she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. For a single heartbeat, the Count stood frozen, as though he had been turned to stone. Then something broke inside him, some dam that had held back 5 centuries of loneliness and longing, and he kissed her back. His lips were cold against hers, as cold as death, but there was a desperate tenderness in the kiss that stole Elena's breath. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and she could feel the terrible strength in his body held in check by sheer force of will. He kissed her as though she were the last source of light in an endless darkness, as though he could draw warmth and life and humanity from her mouth and make them his own. Elena felt herself melting into him, felt her fear dissolving in the face of something far more powerful, the recognition that she had spoken true on the battlements. She was falling in love with this monster, this lost soul, this man who had forgotten what it meant to be human, but who was slowly, painfully remembering. When they finally broke apart, both of them were trembling. The Count's eyes were wide with something that looked like wonder and terror in equal measure. "I have never been kissed," Elena whispered against his lips, echoing the confession she had made to her reflection in the village. "Not until now, not until you." The Count's arms tightened around her. "Then I have stolen something precious from you, something you can never get back." "You have not stolen anything," Elena said firmly. "I gave it freely. My first kiss belongs to you, Vlad Dracula, and I do not regret it." The Count, Vlad, closed his eyes and pressed his forehead to hers, just as he had done weeks ago in the library. "You will be my destruction," he whispered, "or my salvation. I do not know which." "Perhaps both," Elena said, and felt him smile against her hair. They stood like that on the battlements for a long time, holding each other as the night deepened around them and the stars wheeled overhead. And for the first time in 500 years, Vlad Dracula allowed himself to feel something he had thought lost forever. He allowed himself to feel hope. But hope, as Elena would soon discover, could be more dangerous than despair, because hope gave you something to lose. And in a castle ruled by darkness and hunger, loss was the only certainty that endured. The night after their first kiss, Elena could not sleep. She lay in her bed watching the fire burn low, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. The coldness of his lips, the desperation in his touch, the way he had trembled as though something fundamental inside him was breaking and reforming all at once. She touched her own lips and could still feel the ghost of his kiss there, cold and tender and full of centuries of loneliness, finally finding an answer. She should be terrified. Every rational part of her knew that loving a creature like Vlad Dracula was the path to destruction. But her heart, foolish, stubborn, faithful, insisted that she had seen something true in him, something worth fighting for, even if that fight cost her everything. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended peace. Vlad was different after the kiss, more present, more engaged, as though some part of him that had been sleeping for centuries had finally woken. He smiled more easily, laughed at Elena's observations about his vast library's chaotic organization, even agreed to play the piano for her again. They walked through the castle's gardens, dead though they were, and he told her stories of when the grounds had been alive with color and fragrance, when he had employed dozens of gardeners to maintain the beauty he could no longer fully appreciate. "I killed them all eventually," he said without emotion, as they stood before a frozen fountain whose stone cherubs wept ice instead of water. "Not out of hunger, but out of rage. They were witnesses to my damnation, you see. Every time they looked at me with fear, I was reminded of what I had become, so I silenced them one by one until only Vasile remained. And him I kept because his servitude was magically bound. He could not look at me with judgment because he had no will left to judge." "That must have been lonely," Elena said quietly. Vlad looked at her with something like surprise. "Most would say I deserved that loneliness." "Perhaps you did," Elena agreed, "but deserving punishment and needing compassion are not mutually exclusive. You can be guilty and still worthy of mercy." Vlad's expression softened. "You have an answer for everything, don't you?" "Not everything," Elena said, smiling slightly. "But I try." He took her hand, a gesture that was becoming familiar between them, and they walked back toward the castle in comfortable silence. But Elena could sense something beneath his calm exterior, a tension building like a storm gathering on the horizon. On the 4th night after their kiss, the storm broke. Elena woke to find Vlad standing at the foot of her bed. The fire had burned down to embers, and in the dim red glow his face looked gaunt, hollow, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. "The hunger has come," he said, and his voice was hoarse, strained. "I tried to ignore it. I tried to wait until morning to speak with you, but it grows stronger with each hour, and I can feel the madness beginning to creep in at the edges. If I do not feed soon, I will lose control entirely." Elena sat up slowly, her heart hammering but her resolve firm. "Then feed from me." Vlad shook his head sharply. "You do not understand what you are asking. Right now, in this moment, you are not Elena to me. You are blood, warmth, life, everything my cursed body craves. I look at you and I see the pulse in your throat, hear the rush of blood through your veins, smell the sweetness of your mortality. The beast inside me wants to tear you apart and drain every drop. But the man inside you does not want that," Elena said steadily. "The man inside you is stronger than the beast, I believe that." "Your belief may not be enough," Vlad said, and there was anguish in his voice now. "Elena, I am begging you. Let me leave. Let me hunt in the villages below. Let me take someone whose name you do not know, whose face you will never see. Do not make me risk your life on the hope that I can control something that has controlled me for 5 centuries. Elena stood and walked toward him, and she saw him tense like a wolf preparing to spring. But she did not stop. She crossed the distance between them and stood before him, close enough to feel the cold radiating from his body, close enough to see the war raging in his eyes. "I trust you," she said simply. "You should not," Vlad whispered, but his resistance was crumbling. She could see it in the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, in the way his eyes kept dropping to her throat, before forcing themselves back to her face. Elena reached up and pulled aside the collar of her nightgown, exposing the pale column of her neck. "Then prove me wrong. Prove that you are nothing but the monster you claim to be, or prove that there is enough humanity left in you to stop before you take everything." For a long, breathless moment, Vlad simply stared at the exposed skin of her throat. Then, moving slowly as though fighting against himself with every inch, he stepped closer. His cold hand came up to cradle the back of her head, tilting it gently to the side. His breath, cold as a winter wind, ghosted across her skin. "If I cannot stop," he whispered against her throat, "you must push me away. You must fight me with everything you have. Promise me, Elena." "I promise," she whispered back. And then he struck. The pain was immediate and sharp, twin points of fire where his fangs pierced her skin. Elena gasped, her hands instinctively gripping his shoulders, her body going rigid. But then something changed. The pain dissolved into something else, something that was not quite pleasure but was not entirely agony either. It was warmth spreading through her veins, a languid heaviness in her limbs, a sensation like falling into deep water. She could feel him drinking, feel her blood flowing into him, feel the strength slowly draining from her body. His arm had come around her waist, holding her upright as her knees began to weaken, and through it all, she could hear a sound that took her several moments to identify. Vlad was making a low, anguished noise deep in his chest, something between a groan and a sob. Time became strange and fluid. Elena did not know if seconds or minutes had passed. Her vision began to blur at the edges, and a coldness that had nothing to do with Vlad's touch began to creep through her body. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, feel the strength leaching out of her muscles. "Vlad," she managed to whisper, though her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. "Enough!" He did not stop. "Vlad," she said again, more urgently, and tried to push against his shoulders, but her arms had no strength left. The room was spinning now, and the darkness at the edges of her vision was spreading inward like spilled ink. With the last of her strength, Elena did the only thing she could think of. She raised her hand to his face and gently touched his cheek. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Vlad jerked back as though she had burned him, his eyes wide and wild, his lips stained red with her blood. He stared at her in horror as she swayed on her feet, her hand pressed to the wound on her neck, where blood still trickled between her fingers. "Elena," he gasped, and his voice was broken, shattered. "What have I done? What have I—" He caught her as her legs gave out entirely, lifting her as though she weighed nothing and carrying her to the bed. He laid her down with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone who had just been drinking her life away, and pressed his own hand over the wound on her neck, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. "I took too much," he said, and Elena could hear the self-loathing in his voice. "I knew I would, I knew I could not stop, and yet I—" He stopped, unable to continue, his other hand coming up to cover his mouth, as though he could hide the evidence of what he had done. Elena's vision was swimming, and she felt so cold, so terribly cold. But she forced herself to focus on his face, to see past the horror and guilt to the man beneath. "You stopped," she whispered. "When I touched you, you stopped." "I nearly killed you," Vlad said flatly. Another few seconds and he could not finish the sentence. "But you did not," Elena insisted, though speaking required enormous effort. "You stopped because you felt my touch, because you are not only hunger, you are still capable of responding to love." Vlad looked at her with eyes that shimmered with red tears. "This is not love. This is poison. This is damnation spreading from me to you. I have proven everything you refuse to believe about me. I am a monster, Elena, a creature of appetite with no control, and I have done to you exactly what I feared I would do." "You stopped," Elena said again, putting every ounce of conviction she had left into the words. "That is what matters. You stopped." Vlad's hand trembled against her neck. The bleeding had slowed to a trickle, but Elena could feel how weak she had become, how close to the edge of unconsciousness she was teetering. Her body's demands were becoming impossible to ignore. She needed rest, needed time to recover, "You need blood," Vlad said, reading her condition with the expertise of centuries, "or at least iron and meat and time. God, Elena, I have taken so much from you." "Then we learn from it," Elena said, her eyes beginning to drift closed despite her efforts to keep them open. "Next time, we will be more careful. Next time, I will speak sooner, and you will listen faster." "There will be no next time," Vlad said firmly. "I will not risk you again. I will return to hunting in the villages. I will bear the guilt of those deaths, rather than see you brought so close to—" "No," Elena interrupted, forcing her eyes open again. "We will try again. And we will do better. Because this is how we fight the darkness, Vlad. Not by surrendering to it, not by accepting that you must kill to survive, but by finding another way. Together." Vlad stared at her as though she had lost her mind. "You are suggesting that after I nearly drained you to death we should repeat the experience?" "I am suggesting that we learn from our mistakes," Elena said, "that we establish boundaries and signals, that we practice control instead of assuming it is impossible. You stopped when I touched you. That means there is a way to reach you, even when the hunger is strongest. We simply need to find that way and strengthen it." "You are insane," Vlad said, but there was wonder in his voice beneath the fear. "Yes," Elena agreed, "we have established that, but I am also right." Vlad opened his mouth to argue further, but Elena's eyes were already closing. The exhaustion was too great, the pull of unconsciousness too strong. The last thing she felt was Vlad's cold hand gently stroking her hair, and the last thing she heard was his voice, soft and broken, whispering words she did not quite catch. When Elena woke, it was to find sunlight streaming through the windows, weak winter sunlight, but sunlight nonetheless. She felt hollowed out, weak as a newborn kitten, but alive. She turned her head slowly and saw old Vasile sitting in a chair beside her bed, a bowl of broth in his hands. "Miss Elena," he said, and there was profound relief in his voice. "You are awake. The master said you might sleep for days." "How long?" Elena asked, her voice raspy. "A full day and night," Vasile replied. He helped her sit up carefully and held the bowl to her lips. "Drink. You must restore your strength." The broth was rich and salty, and Elena could taste iron in it. Blood, she realized, or at least something heavily fortified to help her body recover from blood loss. She drank it down despite her initial revulsion, knowing her body needed it. "Where is he?" she asked when the bowl was empty. Vasile's expression became carefully neutral. "He has locked himself in the crypt. He will not come out, will not speak to me. He believes he has proven himself irredeemable." Elena's heart clenched. "I need to see him." "Miss, you are still too weak. I need to see him," Elena repeated with more force. "Please, Vasile, help me." The old servant looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "You are just as stubborn as he is." "Very well, but we will go slowly, and if you feel faint, we stop immediately." It took nearly an hour for Elena to dress. Her body felt foreign to her, weak and unsteady, and another hour to make her way through the castle's winding passages to the crypt. Vasile supported her weight with surprising strength for such an old man, and several times they had to stop, so Elena could catch her breath and wait for the dizziness to pass. Finally, they stood before the iron door that led to the crypt. Vasile produced a key and unlocked it, but he did not follow Elena inside. "Some conversations," he said quietly, "are meant to happen in private. I will wait here for you." Elena nodded her gratitude and stepped through the doorway. The crypt was exactly as Vlad had described it, a stone chamber beneath the castle, lit by a few guttering candles, dominated by an ancient sarcophagus stained with earth. And sitting on the floor beside that sarcophagus, his back against the stone, was Vlad. He looked up as Elena entered, and the expression on his face was one of such pure anguish that Elena's breath caught. "You should not be here," he said. "You should be resting, recovering from what I did to you." "I am recovering," Elena said, moving slowly toward him, "but I needed to see you." "Why?" The word was harsh. "To forgive me? To assure me that nearly killing you was somehow acceptable? Save your words, Elena. I do not deserve them." Elena lowered herself carefully to sit beside him, her movement still weak but determined. "I came to tell you that I was right." Vlad looked at her in confusion. "Right about what?" "You stopped," Elena said. "When I touched you, when I called your name, you stopped. Even in the depths of hunger, even when the beast was strongest, you heard me, you felt me, and you stopped." "Barely," Vlad said bitterly. "I took you to the very edge of death before I managed to stop. That is not control, Elena, that is luck. And next time, if there were to be a next time, which there will not be, luck might not be enough. Then we will find something better than luck," Elena said. "We will practice. We will establish clear signals. We will build trust through repetition until stopping becomes instinct rather than struggle." Vlad stared at her, as though seeing her for the first time. "You truly mean to continue this?" "I do," Elena said firmly. "Because I saw something in that moment, Vlad. I saw you fighting. I saw you struggling against your nature with everything you had. And yes, it nearly was not enough. But nearly is not the same as failure. Nearly means we are close. Nearly means with practice and care and faith we can find the way." "You are asking me to risk your life on a hypothesis," Vlad said. "I'm asking you to have faith in us," Elena corrected. "In you and me together. In the possibility that we can build something that is stronger than hunger, stronger than curse, stronger than 5 centuries of damnation." Vlad closed his eyes, and Elena saw his jaw clench. "What if I cannot? What if the next time I feed from you, I drain you completely and there is nothing left but a corpse in my arms? What if I am forced to watch the light die in your eyes, knowing that I am the one who extinguished it? Then you will mourn me," Elena said softly, "and you will remember that I chose this path freely, knowing the risks. But I do not believe that will happen, Vlad. I believe in you, more than you believe in yourself." A sound escaped Vlad's throat, something between a laugh and a sob. "You are going to break me, Elena Vasile. You are going to shatter every defense I have spent centuries building, and I am going to be left vulnerable and raw and utterly at your mercy." "Good," Elena said, and rested her head against his shoulder despite the coldness of his body. Because mercy is what you need, not punishment, not endless guilt, but mercy. From me, from yourself, perhaps even from God. They sat together in the darkness of the crypt, and slowly, tentatively, Vlad's arm came around Elena's shoulders. They remained like that for a long time. Two souls who had found each other in the darkness and were trying desperately to build a light that could survive. The weeks that followed established a new pattern. Vlad fed from Elena regularly now, but they developed a system, a ritual that transformed the act from one of pure hunger into something that was almost sacred in its intimacy and trust. They would sit together in Elena's chamber, the fire burning bright, and Elena would speak to him about her day, about the books she was reading, about anything that would keep her present and alert. Vlad would feed slowly, carefully, his attention split between the blood and Elena's voice. And when Elena felt herself growing weak, she would touch his face or speak his name and he would stop. It was not perfect. There were times when he took too much, and Elena would spend days recovering. There were times when the hunger was so strong that he had to hunt in the villages after all, and would return hollow-eyed with guilt. But gradually, incrementally, his control improved. The bond between them strengthened, and something that had seemed impossible began to seem merely difficult. Elena's body adapted to the regular blood loss. Vasile prepared special meals for her, rich in iron and nutrients. She learned to recognize the signs of weakness before they became dangerous, learned when to call a halt, even if Vlad had not taken what he needed. And Vlad, for his part, learned to read her body's signals, to feel when her heartbeat was slowing too much, to pull back before reaching the point of no return. They were teaching each other a new way to exist, not as monster and victim, but as partners in something that defied every expectation of what their relationship should be. "I never imagined this," Vlad said one night after feeding, holding Elena in his arms as she recovered her strength. "In 500 years, I never once imagined that I could feed without killing, that I could take what I needed and leave the source intact and willing to give again." "That is because you have been alone," Elena said, her voice drowsy but content. "Alone, we are bound by our limitations, but together we can transcend them." But their fragile peace was not to last. One night, 3 months after Elena had first come to the castle, Vasile burst into the library where Elena and Vlad were reading. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "Master," he gasped, "there are men approaching the castle. Armed men, hunters." Vlad was on his feet in an instant, his entire demeanor transforming from scholar to warrior in the space of a heartbeat. "How many?" 20, perhaps more. "They carry crosses and stakes and vials of what might be holy water, and they are led by a priest, a young man who claims he is here to destroy the vampire and rescue the tribute." Elena felt ice settle in her stomach. "Father Andrei, he has sent hunters from the village. They cannot be allowed to enter," Vlad said, his voice cold and flat. "I will meet them at the gates." "No," Elena said, standing as well despite the weakness still in her limbs from the previous night's feeding. "If you meet them as the monster, they will have the confirmation they seek. They will attack, and you will be forced to kill them to protect yourself." "What else would you have me do?" Vlad demanded. "Allow them to storm my home? To drag you away as though you are a prisoner in need of rescue?" "Let me speak to them," Elena said. "Let me tell them the truth, that I am here by choice, that I am not in danger, that they should return to the village and leave us in peace." "They will not believe you," Vlad said. "They will think you have been corrupted, that I have used my powers to control your mind." "Perhaps," Elena admitted, "but it is worth trying, because if they attack and you are forced to defend yourself, the bloodshed will be enormous, and the guilt will destroy whatever progress we have made." Vlad looked at her for a long moment, and Elena could see the war in his eyes, the desire to protect her warring with the knowledge that she was right. "Very well," he said finally. "But I will be watching from the shadows. If they make any move to harm you, I will intervene, and I will show them no mercy." Elena nodded and turned to Vasile. "Take me to the gates." The old servant led her through the castle and out into the courtyard. The night was cold and clear, the stars sharp overhead, and at the gates, exactly as Vasile had said, stood a group of men with torches and weapons. At their head was a figure Elena recognized, Father Andrei, but changed. His face was harder now, set with grim determination, and in his hands he carried a wooden stake and a silver cross. Elena approached the gates slowly, her heart hammering, but her step steady. The men saw her, and a murmur ran through their ranks. "Elena," Father Andrei called out. "Elena Vasile, we have come to rescue you from the monster's clutches. Stand back from the gates so we may break them down." "I do not need rescuing," Elena called back, her voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. "I am here by my own choice. I am not imprisoned. I am not corrupted. I am simply living a life different from the one you would choose for me." Father Andrei's face darkened. "The monster has twisted your mind. He has made you believe you are here willingly. But we know the truth. He is using you, feeding on you, slowly draining your life to satisfy his unholy hunger." "He does feed from me," Elena said, and heard the shocked gasps from the men. "But not against my will. I offer my blood freely so that he does not have to hunt in the villages, so that innocent lives are spared." "That is blasphemy," Father Andrei said, his voice shaking with rage. "You are consorting with evil. You are damning yourself to save a creature that should not exist." "I am choosing love over fear," Elena said. "I am choosing to see the humanity in someone the world has declared irredeemable, and I am asking you, as someone who taught me about mercy and compassion, to respect my choice." "I cannot do that," Father Andrei said flatly. "I have a duty to God and to the village to destroy this evil, and if you will not stand aside willingly, we will take you by force." He gestured to the men behind him, and they surged forward with their weapons raised. Elena did not move. She stood before the gates, her arms spread wide, her voice rising to be heard over the sounds of the approaching mob. "If you wish to reach him, you will have to go through me first. And if you harm me, you will prove that your righteousness is nothing but violence dressed in holy words." The men hesitated, unwilling to attack an unarmed woman. But Father Andrei did not hesitate. He raised his stake and moved toward the gates, his face twisted with zealous fury. "Move aside, child. I will not let you sacrifice yourself for this demon." "Then you do not understand the meaning of sacrifice," Elena said quietly. And then Vlad was there, materializing from the shadows with such speed that the men cried out in fear. He stood beside Elena, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes burning red in the torchlight. "She has said she will not go with you," Vlad said, his voice cold as the grave. "And I will not allow you to take her by force. Leave now, priest, and take your men with you, or learn what it truly means to face the monster you claim to hunt." Father Andrei raised his cross, and the silver gleamed in the firelight. "In the name of God, I command you to release her." Vlad laughed, a sound without humor, without warmth. "Your God abandoned me centuries ago, priest. His symbols hold no power here." Father Andrei's face paled, but he did not lower the cross. Instead, he turned to his men and shouted, "Attack! Destroy the demon!" The men surged forward with shouts of fear and rage, stakes and blades raised high, and Vlad moved. He was faster than human eyes could follow, stronger than mortal flesh could match. He tore through the hunters like a wolf among sheep, his movements efficient and brutal. Men fell with torn throats, broken necks, chests pierced by their own stakes turned against them. Blood sprayed across the courtyard stones, and screams of pain and terror filled the night air. Elena watched in horror as Vlad became everything he had feared himself to be, a monster of pure violence, unstoppable and merciless. She saw Father Andrei fall with Vlad's hand around his throat, saw the old priest's eyes bulge with terror, saw Vlad's fangs descend toward the exposed neck. "Vlad, stop!" Elena's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Vlad froze, his teeth inches from Father Andrei's throat, his entire body trembling with the effort of restraint. "Let him go," Elena said, walking through the carnage toward them. Bodies lay scattered around the courtyard, some dead, some dying, all of them testament to what Vlad was capable of when threatened. "You have proven your point. You have defended your home. But if you kill him, you will prove everything he believes about you. You will become the mindless monster he has declared you to be." Vlad's eyes met hers, and Elena saw the war raging there, the hunger, the rage, the centuries of persecution and pain demanding vengeance. But beneath all that, she saw the man who had stopped when she touched his face, who had learned control through trust, who had dared to hope that redemption might still be possible. "He came to kill me," Vlad said, his voice raw. "He came to take you away." "I know," Elena said gently. "And you defended us. But defense is not the same as massacre. You can choose mercy, Vlad. You can prove that you are more than your darkest nature." For a long, breathless moment, Vlad did not move. Then, slowly, he released Father Andrei, letting the priest collapse to the ground in a gasping, trembling heap. "Go," Vlad said, his voice cold but controlled. Take your wounded and your dead and return to your village. Tell them what you have seen here, that Elena Vasile remains by her own choice, and that any who come to rescue her will meet the same fate as your men. And tell them this as well, that if they leave us in peace, we will offer them the same courtesy." Father Andre looked up at Vlad with eyes full of terror and confusion. Then his gaze moved to Elena, and what she saw there made her heart ache. Betrayal, sorrow, and the terrible understanding that she was truly lost to him and to the village. "You have damned yourself," he whispered. "Perhaps," Elena said, "or perhaps I have found salvation in the last place anyone thought to look for it. Go home, Father, tend to your flock, and pray that your God is more merciful than you have been tonight." Father Andre staggered to his feet and began gathering the surviving hunters. They loaded their dead onto carts brought for the purpose and fled down the mountain road, their torches fading into the distance like dying stars. When they were gone, Eleanor turned to look at the courtyard. It was a scene of horror. Blood on the stones, bodies of the fallen, the evidence of violence that could never be taken back. "I tried," Vlad said quietly, and his voice was hollow. "I tried to be more than the monster. But in the end, this is what I am. This is what I will always be." Eleanor walked to him and took his blood-stained hands in hers. "You stopped. When I asked you to spare Father Andre, you stopped. That is what matters." "I killed so many," Vlad whispered. "Their blood is on my hands, literally and figuratively." "Yes," Elena agreed, "and you will carry that guilt. But you also showed mercy when mercy was the hardest thing to give. You let your enemy live when every instinct screamed for you to kill him. That is growth, Vlad. That is change. That is proof that you are not beyond redemption." Vlad looked down at their joined hands, his stained with blood, hers pale and clean. "How can you bear to touch me after what you have just witnessed?" "Because I see all of you," Elena said. "The monster and the man, the violence and the restraint, the darkness and the light struggling to break through. And I love all of it, Vlad. I love you." Vlad's eyes widened and something cracked in his expression, some final wall that had been holding back 5 centuries of emotion. He pulled Elena into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe, his body shaking with sobs that had no tears. "I do not deserve you," he whispered against her hair. "I do not deserve this. I do not deserve love or mercy or hope or any of the things you offer me so freely." "Perhaps not," Eleanor said, wrapping her arms around him. "But you have them anyway. Because love is not about deserving. It is about choosing. And I choose you, Vlad Dracula. In all your darkness and all your light, I choose you." They stood like that in the bloody courtyard, as dawn began to touch the eastern sky with pale fingers of light. And for the first time in 500 years, Vlad Dracula wept. Not tears of blood, but something that might have been their precursor. Tears of grief and guilt and desperate, fragile hope. The months that followed were difficult. The village declared Elena dead to them, not physically but spiritually. No one would speak her name. No one would acknowledge that she had ever existed. She became a ghost, a cautionary tale, a warning to others about the price of compassion misplaced. But in the castle, something new was growing. Vlad began to venture out at night not to hunt but to help, leaving food at the doorsteps of starving families, gold coins in the collection box of the church, medicine for the sick. He did these things anonymously, with Elena's encouragement, and though the villagers never knew the source of their unexpected blessings, Elena saw the change in Vlad each time he returned. "It is not enough," he would say after each act of charity. "It does not balance the scales of what I have done." "No," Elena would agree, "but it is a beginning, and beginnings matter." She also convinced him to spare Vasile from his magical binding. The old servant wept when Vlad released him from the oath that had kept him prisoner for over 2 centuries, and Elena thought he would leave immediately. But instead Vasile chose to stay. "Where else would I go?" he said simply. "Everyone I knew is dead. The world has moved on without me. At least here, I have purpose. And now I serve by choice rather than compulsion. That makes all the difference." Elena taught Vlad other things too, how to laugh without bitterness, how to appreciate beauty without the taint of loss, how to exist in the present rather than dwelling endlessly on the past. She sang to him, read him poetry, forced him to play the piano not for her, but for himself. She reminded him day by day, moment by moment, that he was still capable of joy. And Vlad, in turn, taught Elena things she had never known. He showed her the world through eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. He taught her languages, philosophy, the accumulated wisdom of centuries. He was patient with her questions, honest about his failures, and gradually, so gradually that neither of them quite noticed when it happened, he became comfortable with the idea that he might deserve the happiness she offered him. They fed together regularly now, and it had become an act of intimacy rather than necessity, a way of connecting, of sharing, of affirming the bond between them. Elena's blood sustained Vlad's body, and his presence sustained her spirit. They had found a balance that should have been impossible, that defied every expectation and every legend. "I love you," Vlad said to her one night as they lay together in her bed. Elena wrapped in blankets against the cold, and Vlad stretched beside her, his hand gently stroking her hair. "I did not think I was still capable of love, but you have proven me wrong about so many things. Why not that as well?" "I love you too," Elena replied, turning to face him. "My monster, my man, my Vlad." He smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine and free of the bitterness that had once defined him. Then he leaned down and kissed her, and it was different from their first kiss on the battlements. This one held certainty instead of hesitation, peace instead of desperation, the confidence of two souls who had chosen each other and would continue choosing each other against all odds. When they broke apart, Vlad rested his forehead against hers, just as he had done so many times before. "We are impossible," he whispered. "Yes," Elena agreed, "but we are also real." Years passed. Elena grew older, her body changing as mortal bodies do, while Vlad remained unchanged, eternal, frozen in the moment of his damnation. They both knew what would come eventually, that she would age and die, and he would continue on without her, carrying her memory into whatever endless future awaited him. But they did not speak of it, not yet. There would be time for sorrow later. For now, they had the present. They had each morning that Elena woke in Vlad's arms, each evening spent in conversation by the fire, each moment of laughter and learning and love. They had built something that should not have been possible, a relationship between darkness and light that did not destroy one or corrupt the other, but instead allowed both to exist in balance. Elena knew that their story would never be told as a fairy tale. There would be no village celebration of their love, no bard singing songs of the pure maiden who tamed the monster. They would exist in shadow and secrecy, known only to themselves and to old Vasile, who watched over them both with the devotion of someone who understood the miracle of their survival. But that was enough, more than enough, because Elena had never sought fame or glory. She had sought only to live a life that mattered, to make choices that reflected her values rather than her fears, to love without reservation, even when that love was dangerous and difficult and doomed to end in loss. And she had succeeded beyond her wildest imagining. On a winter night, 20 years after Elena had first come to the castle, she stood at the window of the library, watching snow fall over the mountains. Her hair was streaked with silver now, her face lined with the years, but her eyes still held the same fierce compassion that had first captured Vlad's attention. Vlad came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. He looked exactly as he had 2 decades earlier, unchanged, unchanging, eternal. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. "The life you might have had if you had refused to be the tribute, if you had let someone else take your place." Elena thought about it, really thought, considering all the paths her life might have taken. She could have married some village man, raised children, grown old surrounded by family and community. She could have died in her bed in Valeni, mourned by people who knew her name, but she would never have known this, never have loved this deeply, never have proven that redemption was possible even for the damned. "No," she said finally, "I regret nothing, because you were worth it, Vlad. This love was worth every sacrifice, every risk, every moment of fear. I would make the same choice again without hesitation." Vlad raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You saved me," he whispered. "You saved me from myself, from the darkness, from 500 years of damnation. How can I ever repay such a debt?" "You already have," Elena said, smiling up at him. "You let me love you. You let me see your humanity. You gave me a life of meaning and purpose and joy. What greater gift could there be?" They stood together at the window as the snow fell and the night deepened around them, and though they both knew that their time was finite, that death would eventually claim Elena and leave Vlad to face eternity alone once more, neither of them spoke of it. Because they had learned in their years together that the value of love is not measured by its duration, but by its depth, that a single moment of true connection can outweigh an eternity of empty existence. That hope, once kindled, can survive even in the darkest places. Elena Vasili had come to Castle Dracula expecting to die. Instead, she had learned to live, truly, deeply, impossibly live. And in teaching Vlad to hope, she had also taught herself that love was not about safety or certainty or perfect endings. Love was about choosing someone over and over again, despite every reason not to. It was about seeing the worst in them and loving them anyway. It was about building something beautiful from broken pieces and calling it home. And as the snow fell and the night embraced them, Elena and Vlad held each other close and knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, whether years or decades or the inevitable separation that mortality demanded, they had succeeded in doing the impossible. They had found love in the darkness, and that love, however brief, however doomed, had been enough to light the way for both of them. It had been enough to change everything. And in a castle that had known only death for 500 years, that was nothing short of a miracle. The end